25 years ago, I remember I was invited down to London to speak to an audience of about 1,000 people in London's largest Orthodox synagogue, which is called Kinloss Gardens Synagogue. The normal process is that you're introduced, you give the talk, and then after you've finished, 45 minutes or so later, the MC invites questions, a few questions from the audience. These questions were asked, I gave my answers, and the MC then thanked me, and then people started to go home. But there are always some individuals who want to speak to you privately or personally, and there was a group of about 20 gathered around me asking various questions. And I noticed out of the corner of my eyes, there was, I used to say an older fellow, but probably somebody around about my age, clearly holding back, standing back from the crowd, waiting for everybody to be finished so he could speak to me on his own. And when that moment arrived, he walked towards me and said, Rabbi Rubinstein, you said you live in Manchester in England, which is where I used to live before I moved to the United States. And I said, yes. He said, which part of Manchester do you live in? And I said, I live in Broughton Park. And he said, is that near Prestwich? I said, yes, it's the adjoining neighbourhood. They merge into each other. Then he said, do you know? And he mentioned somebody by name. I said, yes, I know him. In fact, he used to be a student of mine. He said, how's he getting on? I said, as far as I know, he's doing fine. He said, how many kids does he have these days? I said, how many kids? I think it's two girls and a boy. I think, yes, 2 girls and a boy, I said. He said, what does he do for a living, was his next question. I said, for a living, accountant. I think he's an accountant. And then he asked me another question. Can't remember what it was or what I answered. And then, of course, it came to be my turn to ask the inevitable question, which was, of course, how do you know him? And he looked at me, and then he slowly looked down at the carpet, and in a very small voice he said, he's my son. He's my son. I said, forgive me for asking, but how come you don't know how many grandchildren you have? So he told me a story of a teenage rebellion and how he and his wife had tried absolutely every trick they thought they knew in order to get their son back on course, back on the path. Nothing had worked. And then one night the father made a mistake, because all parents are human. We make mistakes. And he made a big one. He lost his temper and he screamed at his son, get out, and don't set foot over my front door again. And so 14 years later, how many children does he have? So I said to him, look, I can't promise or pretend that I know your son very well, but I do think I know him well enough to be able to tell you that he'd like to see his father again. And he said, oh no, too much water has flowed underneath the bridge. I said, okay, so suppose you give me your phone number, and suppose you give me your address, and suppose I give you monthly reports as to how your family's doing. And he said, I like that idea. So he gave me his phone number, gave me his address, and I got back in my car and drove the boring 4-hour drive from London to Manchester. And the next day, by coincidence, I bumped into his son, because you can always arrange a coincidence. I said, how are you doing? He said, fine. I said, I was just down in London and I met somebody who knows you very well, was asking after you. And he said, really, who? I said, your father. And he said, how's he getting on? I said, he seems to be doing okay, but I think he'd be doing a lot better if he could see his son again. And he said, listen to this, oh no, too much water has flowed underneath the bridge. I said, look, by coincidence, I'm going down to London again tomorrow. Another coincidence. How about if I take you in to see your father? And he hesitated. I said, look, I'll pick you up at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'll drive you down, and I'll go in with you. I started to walk towards my car, and he was thinking, and he started to say something. I was already sitting in the driver's seat. I said, I'm terribly sorry. I've got a very important sheer lecture to give. I'll pick you up tomorrow, and drove away. Got home, picked up the phone, dialed the father. He picked up the phone. I said, Mr. Cohen, are you going to be in tomorrow, round about 2:00? He said, yes. I think he expected that I was going to be phoning with a report. I said, good, I'm bringing your son to see you. He started to say something. I said, I'm sorry, I've got to give a lecture, and I hung up. The next morning, I picked the son up at 10:00, and we drove down that boring 4-hour drive from Manchester to London, although it just seemed like 4 minutes, and we were there already. I parked the car outside the house. We walked up the driveway of the house together. I had to knock on the front door. He was too nervous. Knocked on the door, no answer. Waited a few minutes, knocked on the door again, still no answer. And I thought, oh dear, the father's chickened out. I was going to knock again, and behind the frosted glass panel in the door, I could see a shape forming, and then the door opened, and there was the father looking at the son, and the son looking at his dad, both seeing somebody they hadn't seen for 14 years. The father had tears streaming down his cheeks. The son had tears streaming down his cheeks. I had tears streaming down my cheeks. The son took one step towards his daddy, and his daddy rushed out and folded him in a hug. And they walked together, arms around each other's shoulders, into the house, and I was wonderfully and gloriously redundant. I shouted to the house that I would be into the hallway. I'd come back in 2 hours' time. I went to see my own family in London. I came back, picked up the son, took him back to Manchester, and within 6 months, that boy, he was not a boy, he was a man, that man had sold his business, sold his home in Manchester, and moved with his 3 children and his wife to a new house in London, 2 streets away from where his father lived, in order to be near his dad and for his grandchildren to see their grandfather and grandmother growing up. We believe that we have a relationship with God. We believe he's the Father and we're the Son. But that also means that if that's the relationship, then we're also brothers and sisters to one another too. And there's a very interesting idea. I'm sure you know this. I know because I've taught in schools all my life. At the end of the year, when you have to write report cards, when you put the mark, that's easy. Whatever they go, A, B, C, 70%, 90%, 80%. But the real art form is writing teachers' comments. You can't possibly say the truth. You've got to allude. You've got to hint. Could have tried harder. I mean, didn't work the whole year, but you can't say that. Why? Because they're parents. Parents love their children. Parents don't want to hear anything bad about their children because they're family. Well, the world's busy at the moment telling lots of stuff about us that's bad. And it seems to be an insatiable appetite to hear all sorts of bad stuff about us. But it's something we mustn't do. We've got to, as we always have, know that we are a good people, a people who are proud. And all the centuries' crazy ideas about us being miserly, when it's the exact opposite. Killing babies and drinking their blood or using their blood for matzah. Insane nonsense. Well, that sort of stuff is actually re-emerging now. We owe it to our family, to our people, and certainly for the last 2,000 years of Jews had no choice but to swallow this stuff, not to swallow this stuff, to know who we are, to discover, if we don't know who the Jewish people are, what our beliefs are, what our religion is, to discover it again. Because the world is only going to tell us that we're bad people. I think you know, I certainly know, it's the exact opposite.